And there we go. All right, take two. Thanks everyone for joining us for tonight's lecture. My name is Katie Zimmerman from Lake Johnson Park, and I will be your host for the evening. As you may have noticed, this lecture is recorded. If you do not wish to appear on the recording, keep that camera off, and everyone will stay muted as well. If you have questions during the presentation, please utilize the chat feature. That is fine to do so as they occur to you. Just know that I will not be reading them out until we reach the time for Q&A at the end of the lecture, and I'll talk more about the logistics of that when we get there. And on that note, I'm going to pass you guys on to our presenter for our evening.
Thank you very much, Katie. My name is Fallon Owens, and I am a wildlife extension biologist with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, and my specialty is human-wildlife interactions. Let me go ahead and share my screen so you guys can see my presentation. Give me a second. I think that's working, and let me make sure that I've clicked all the thingies that I need to click for this to be the best experience for you. I think I've got it covered. So yes, let's talk about wildlife encounters, or specifically human encounters with wildlife. Wildlife encounters come in two main flavors. And my agency sort of is responsible in a lot of ways for both types, but let's talk about the difference between expected encounters with wildlife or voluntary ones. And those are things like going out hunting or fishing or bird watching or otherwise consenting to some sort of wildlife experience. That's sort of one whole world of wildlife encounters. But what I'm going to talk about today is actually going to be the whole world of unexpected wildlife encounters, the situations that people didn't sign up for, that they didn't expect, and usually are involuntary and may not have been one that people are really prepared for. Um, so my agency, the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, is responsible for managing and conserving all of the native wildlife species in the state of North Carolina. That includes our most common species all the way to the most rare and endangered species. So there's a lot of different types of management that we do, from keeping track of different wildlife populations, regulating hunting and fishing seasons, protecting endangered species, but also helping people understand wildlife and how to interact responsibly with wildlife. So to that end, one of the services that the commission provides is something called the North Carolina Wildlife Helpline. And this is basically a phone service that you can call here in North Carolina. I'll give more details about that in a little bit. But you can call or email and basically speak to a biologist about whatever questions you have about wildlife and wildlife encounters. And this is a very popular service that's only been around since 2017. And to give you a sense of that, last year, the Wildlife Helpline took almost 30,000 calls and emails from the public and helped provide services for all of those different encounters. So it's a really popular service. And this is kind of what happens if you were to call the helpline. You would, on the other end, be able to speak to a wildlife biologist. This is Brett, one of our former biologists, who's now working for Wake County, I believe, and we miss him very much. But essentially, he would pick up the phone and you would explain what type of wildlife encounter you've had and your questions about it. So let's just say somebody has a raccoon that's coming and feeding on the cat food that they leave outside for the stray cats. And what Brett would then do, or our other helpline biologists, would be to explain the biology, what things to be concerned about, and especially how to prevent problems in a situation like this. And right off the bat, the recommendation would be to stop putting pet food outside for animals, or find a way to feed them without giving wildlife access to that food, for a lot of reasons that can cause harm to the cats, to the raccoons themselves, and possibly to people. But one of the things that also happens if you were to call or email the helpline is that the biologist will basically take some notes about some of the sort of important aspects of the call, especially what species was involved, what was the nature of the situation, what was recommended, and usually at most specific, like the county. Where did this happen in North Carolina? What county? And so we get a small amount of data from each of these encounters. And with that data, we can really learn some powerful things about what kind of encounters people are having with wildlife in North Carolina. So part of what everything I'm going to say is going to basically come from this data set that we have about these real world wildlife encounters. So when I provide recommendations, I'm not just saying it because I heard somewhere that this is what people should be doing. This is legitimately based off of real world data and real world recommendations to prevent problems and help people interact with wildlife responsibly. So, right from the start, let's just kind of get a overall view of what types of animals people are encountering that they're reporting about. So we'll look at last year's data and see the most common species that people were calling about on the helpline. And you can see the top four I have pictures for. Right at the very top, we've got our white-tailed deer. Then we've got bears, songbirds, which is kind of a catch-all for any passerine or songbird species, which actually includes a lot of different species of birds. And then we've got raccoon, fox, coyote. And let's just like take a look at what types of calls people are or encounters people are having, right? So we have like the sum total of all of the species and how like which species people call mostly about, but we actually break down these calls into some basic categories. First, and the two big ones are complaints. So for the examples here on the slide, we've got somebody could be calling about deer, which was the number one species that people called about, but they could be complaining that there was a deer getting into their vegetable garden or their flower garden, and they wanted to know what they could do to protect their plants, right? So that would be categorized as a complaint. The other major category is health concerns. So a totally different call could be about somebody finding a deer fawn in their backyard and wanting to know what they should do about it, like how they should help the fawn. Is there any reason to be concerned? So both about deer, very, very different types of situations. And then the third category, which is significantly less than the other two, is basically just sightings. That could be sightings for species that my agency is looking for from the public, like reported sightings of armadillos, which are currently going through a range expansion here in North Carolina. So we want to hear when people see them because, that might be the very first time that we actually get a recorded observation in a given county for that species. But again, the top two types of calls we get are complaints about wildlife and health concerns. So if we break it down just into the category of complaints, the data looks a little bit different. So right at the top now, instead of deer calls, the number one most complained about species in North Carolina is bears. And that kind of makes sense because bears are really big and most people don't feel comfortable having bears around them in their neighborhood or around their home. And that's a really common occurrence, especially in the mountains of North Carolina and in some parts of the coast. If you live in the Piedmont, say in Raleigh, we actually have bears here too, but the population is very, very small and tends to be transient. So here in the middle part of the state, we might see one or two bears pass through in the springtime, usually younger bears that are kind of trying to find their own territory, and they're doing a lot of wandering before they find some place to stay permanently. But in the mountains and the coast, we definitely have very robust bear populations. And a lot of times people are concerned in a bad way about having bears close by. We also have raccoons are now number two. We've got foxes, coyotes, and then deer are still there, but they're number five now in terms of complaints about wildlife. And then you can see some of the other types of animals: snakes, groundhogs, skunks, bats, opossums, and the list goes on. But these are the heavy hitters for complaints. Now, just zooming in on bears, I have two pictures representing the number one and number two type of complaint that people report. So you can see in one picture, we've got a bear getting into the trash. And in the other picture, we've got a bear getting into a bird feeder. These are the top two situations that cause and lead to complaints with bears. This is really, really important for us to have data on because that allows us to address the situations that people have with bears using real data. And one of the things that we've been able to do with that is create a whole outreach program called BearWise. If you've never heard of it before, but you live in a place that has bears, this is a fantastic program that is basically based off of real world data in the United States, including North Carolina. It started in the southeastern United States, and it was so popular and so effective that it got adopted nationwide. And essentially, it provides all sorts of advice and recommendations and information about bear behavior and how to prevent conflicts with bears. And you can see there's 6 BearWise basics, and these are the top 3. Again, based on data, based on the types of problems that people have with bears, these are the most effective recommendations that we can give for people to prevent problems with bears. We've got never feed a bear or approach a bear, secure food, garbage, and recycling, remove bird feeders when bears are active. I'm wondering if you see a trend here, and if you do, that trend actually is going to come up a lot in this whole presentation, and it really focuses on removing food sources that attract wild animals to people's homes and neighborhoods. So right off the bat, most of our recommendations about preventing conflicts with bears center around removing food attractants that pull bears from the surrounding areas into people's backyards, which can cause real problems for bears and for humans and for pets. So, for example, we know from the data that a lot of these situations that start off with, oh, there's a bear in my bird feeder, and it, it's visited for a few days and it keeps eating the bird seed. And then next week it's like, oh, well, it took down the bird feeder and it destroyed it, but I put another one up. And then a month after that, like, oh, well, the bear is really hanging around a lot more. These types of encounters tend to escalate. So in the end, every year we have a number of situations where bears actually start breaking into homes, breaking into garages and vehicles. And because they keep getting food rewards close to people and around homes, they keep coming back over and over again. And they periodically or eventually they become more bold to the point where they've lost a lot of their fear around seeing or being around people. And that can cause real serious issues with property damage and risk to human lives. And oftentimes these bears end up getting put down, which is really unfortunate and preventable. So again, that BearWise program that we have, it's bearwise.org if you want to visit, has a lot of recommendations that can help people live responsibly around bears to prevent bears from having to be euthanized in the end because they've gotten so used to humans and getting food rewards around homes. And these are just a smattering of recent reports about bears that had to be put down because they were breaking into homes, again, because they kept getting access to food. So there's an overall takeaway from this that I want to start off with, and that is in the human wildlife interaction world, in the wildlife encounter world, people who do the work that I do, often this theme emerges, which is that the key to coexisting with wildlife often doesn't involve changing wild animal behavior or doing really anything to the animals themselves. It's more about educating people and changing human beings to change their behavior and their expectations so that we can prevent these problems in the first place. I want to talk just a teeny bit about relocation. Oftentimes, right off the bat, when somebody has their first negative wildlife encounter, they've got an animal in their yard that they don't want there, they want to have that animal relocated. They don't want any harm to come to it. They want the animal to be fine. They just want it to be somewhere else. And unfortunately, for better or for worse, relocation is often not a humane option for dealing with wildlife conflicts. One, most wild animals have a home range. And if you can imagine what it would be like if somebody picked you up out of your front yard and transported you over all the way over to Texas and just dropped you off on the side of the road, would you be able to survive in that situation? Um, Not every patch of woods is the same to a wild animal. Where they live is their home. It's where they know food is, where the water sources are. They know where safety is. They know where risks are. They know where their conspecific or other species territory boundaries are. When you take a wild animal away from its home, you are not doing it any favors. And oftentimes, wild animals do not survive relocation. The unfortunate reality is that a relocated animal usually does not survive. Um, and if they do manage to survive long enough, usually they're going to try to find their way back home, which, if they're successful, means that you're just right back where you started and your problem hasn't been solved. And also, do you really want to be relocating an animal that's causing property or problems on your property onto somebody else's property? Because that can hold liability risks that are not great. Also, wild animals carry parasites and diseases, some of which are dangerous to humans, but many of which are just dangerous to members of their own species. So you can also spread diseases to those wildlife populations by moving animals around on the landscape. It's not a great idea. And then finally, and you might think this is more or less important, but it is illegal in North Carolina to relocate most wild animal species for all the reasons that I've listed. It's not humane, it can spread diseases, and it can cause real problems for wildlife and for humans. Um, so, all that said, I want to go into some of the common types of encounters and recommendations for handling those encounters. And these are the types of things that I wish were more common knowledge out in the broader world. Let's kind of get into it and see, what these encounters look like. Um, Here I have 3 of our common, ubiquitous, abundant wild canines in North Carolina. We do have one other species of wild canine, and that's the red wolf, which is only located in a few counties on the eastern part of the state in the Albemarle Peninsula and in very, very, very small numbers. So these are the 3 wild canine species that are everywhere in North Carolina and very abundant. So I've given you a little bit of time to look, and now I'll label them. We've got the gray fox in the top left, the eastern coyote in the bottom left, and then the red fox. Again, very common, ubiquitous species across the state. Now, just speaking about coyotes really briefly, a lot of people, when they see or hear that there's a coyote in their area for the first time, their instant reaction is to worry about this animal attacking people or children. And fortunately, that is very, very, very rarely the case. Our coyotes are really, for the most part, not interested in human beings. However, they are kind of small or middle-sized predators, and a small animal that's roughly the size of their natural food, like a rabbit, that's outside and completely unsupervised, could be on the dinner menu for coyotes, which are very opportunistic. So when we look at the data, what we see is the actual things that people report about coyotes is outdoor cats going missing. Whether or not a coyote had anything to do with it, coyotes are often blamed, and oftentimes they are the culprit. Off-leash dogs, especially very small toy breed dogs that are roughly the size of a rabbit. Coyote is going to be opportunistic if it sees a small animal running around with no human nearby. So those small animals that are off leash are at risk. And in the same vein, unprotected small livestock. So think chickens, maybe like baby lambs or goats if you have a farm. These are, again, very small, very vulnerable prey animals that coyotes can take advantage of if they're not protected or supervised or in an enclosure that keeps predators out. And then lastly, what we see is issues with habituated coyotes. And habituated is a term that we use in the wildlife management world, which basically means an animal that has been trained by humans, sometimes intentionally, but sometimes unintentionally, to not fear people. So think an animal that has been hand fed since it was very young and has learned that human beings are safe to be around, that they are a source of food. Basically, an animal that's kind of quasi-tamed, but wild animals cannot be tamed. They can lose their fear of people, and that can be dangerous for people if you have an animal that is wild and unpredictable. So habituated coyotes can cause problems for people. So anyway, these are all of the issues that we really see most often when people call about having problems with coyotes. And the good news is that all of these situations are preventable. We can secure and supervise and protect our small pets and livestock, and we can not try to train coyotes not to be afraid of humans. And that is how we can live peacefully with the coyotes, which, trust me, are everywhere. They are very ubiquitous, whether you know they're there or not. Coyotes are everywhere in North Carolina now. So just to say that in another way with some pictures, essentially here we have a smorgasbord of prey items for coyotes, things that a coyote might consider to be a food item. And in the top, we've got natural prey items. By the way, coyotes provide excellent pest control in the form of regulating these populations of small rodents and rabbits. These are species that need to have predators to keep their populations in check, and coyotes do that service. But at the bottom here, we've got pets and livestock that can end up being prey for coyotes, but it is within our power to keep these animals protected. So dogs on leash or supervised when they're outside, cats inside, chickens inside a predator-proof coop and run. These are how we can prevent issues with coyotes in North Carolina. And I just have to say it, outdoor cats are incredibly damaging to wild ecosystems. They kill a lot of wildlife, especially songbirds. But if you know somebody who doesn't really care about the fact that cats are an unnatural invasive predator on the environment, it might be more useful to talk about the fact that coyotes are ubiquitous in North Carolina, and a coyote is definitely not going to think twice about eating a cat that isn't really afraid of larger animals. So outdoor cats are dangerous for wildlife and for the cats themselves, and the best cat is an indoor cat. Really briefly, I kind of want to show what is recommended if you've got a coyote that just has basically spent so much time in neighborhoods that it's not immediately going to run away the second it sees a person. Um, this is a video that was taken in Florida showing how to haze a coyote. So this is a biologist who was called about a coyote that was hanging around a golf course. You can see she's just walking towards the coyote, raising her arms, sort of yelling. And the key, she's being consistent. She's not backing away. She's continuing to press that coyote. Basically, it's turning around and checking to see if she's still coming after it. And, you know, it's sort of like taking a little while to realize, yeah, it's gotta move on. It's gotta get out of there. So this is normal, healthy coyote behavior. Coyotes are afraid of humans. They don't really want to come up close to us, even if they're kind of used to being in the same general area as people. If you approach a healthy coyote, it's going to go in the opposite direction. And if you've got a coyote in your neighborhood or in your backyard that's getting a little bit too comfortable, hazing it and basically chasing it off whenever you see it is a really great way to teach that coyote that its presence is not welcome, and that can help reduce some of these issues. They're territorial animals, so they understand what a bigger, stronger animal says. This is my territory. You are not allowed to be here. Stay out. I could talk about coyotes all day, but because I want to talk about other species, I want to mention that there is an hour-long talk just about coyotes that's recorded that I gave a few years ago for the city of Charlotte. If you use your phone to go through that QR code, you can see the recorded YouTube video of that recording. So if you want to know more about coyotes, I recommend you check that out. And now let's go sort of back to foxes. We got our two species of foxes. And here is data showing when people call in North Carolina about coyotes. And you see the biggest peak in calls about coyotes are complaints during the kit rearing season. All right. These are very seasonal. And the reason why we get this big, strong peak of complaints about foxes at that time of year, which May, June, July timeframe, is because foxes, both gray and red foxes, are pretty comfortable building their dens right up underneath human structures. So this is usually what people are calling about. They've got an outbuilding or they've got a porch and it's got a little crawl space underneath. And all of a sudden they're seeing baby foxes poke their heads up from underneath. And they're really, really worried because they've heard that, foxes can be dangerous and they want these animals gone. This is a really common situation. And the preventative way, now that you know that foxes are okay with denning underneath buildings, basically keeping them out in the first place is a great way to prevent you from ever having to deal with a situation like this. So barriers, especially that include wire, so chicken wire or a hardware cloth, or it's like metal wire mesh, that's a really great way to keep animals from getting access to underneath buildings. And that'll keep foxes out, but it'll also keep skunks out, which also like to hang out underneath buildings. Opossums, groundhogs, all sorts of critters can be kept out from underneath your building if you prevent them from getting access in the first place. So prevention is always a better solution than having to sort of retroactively deal with an animal that is a little bit too close for comfort. Other options for dealing with foxes that are hanging around in the yard or maybe denning underneath a building. Honestly, they do not live in a den permanently. Foxes will only use a den basically as a crib or nursery when their kits are so young that they can't really survive outside. When they're adults, they just sleep under bushes or wherever they feel like. They don't live in a den permanently. So if you can just wait it out for a few weeks, typically at some point they're going to leave on their own without the homeowner having to do anything about it. But then there's also hazing, or basically making that area so uncomfortable for them that they want to leave on their own. And that can be making noise, chasing them off whenever you see them, spraying them with water. The picture here shows motion detecting water sprinklers that you can get at most hardware stores these days or online that spray water in the direction of an animal that is moving. Or you can use household ammonia and pour that onto a rag and kind of throw that into a semi-enclosed space, like the crawl space, to create a smell that's just so noxious that the animal doesn't want to stay there. And the point of these is to basically create an environment that's so uncomfortable that the animal will relocate itself. And the important thing to know here is foxes cannot legally be relocated. So if you want foxes to move on, the best way to do it is to get them to leave on their own. And if you can convince the parent foxes that the area is not safe, they will take their pups with them. They will carry their pups or kits in their mouth and they will transport them to an alternate den site. So that is the best possible situation or solution to having a fox den a little bit too close for comfort. Basically, just make a really hostile environment without hurting them. It's very effective. Because we're talking about foxes and there's a lot of worry and misunderstanding about rabies, let's take a second to talk about rabies in North Carolina. North Carolina is one of the top 6 states in the entire country for rabies incidents. So rabies is very serious here in North Carolina. And this is the data showing basically all of the animals that have tested positive for rabies since 1990 here in North Carolina. And you can see right off the bat, raccoons are number 1. Then we've got skunks, then foxes, then bats. Those are our top 4 rabies vector species in wildlife. Then we've got cats and dogs. And then this other category that's got a smattering of other oddball animals, including coyotes. You'll notice coyotes, there's only 23, I think now 24 coyotes that have tested positive for rabies. So it's actually kind of rare in coyotes here, and that's a good thing. I'm happy to be able to say that. But it's important to understand that the variant of rabies that we have in North Carolina most commonly is the raccoon variant. So raccoons are the basically the reservoir species. And when a skunk or a fox or cat or dog gets rabies, it's usually also the raccoon variant of rabies. So raccoons are really a species that you do not want to be coming in close contact with, or really any of these other animals. But that'll give you a little bit clearer view of which species you really kind of have to be worried about close encounters with. Definitely do not try to take any raccoons home, even little babies. Don't try to pet them or feed them or turn them into pets. These are not pets, and they're species that can have rabies. So going kind of back to the fox thing, because a lot of people, when they find a fox den underneath their porch, instantly they're usually worried about rabies. So I kind of want to talk about what to be concerned with and what not to be concerned with if you see a rabies vector species or an animal that is one of those species that could have rabies. It's really important to know that rabies causes neurological symptoms, right? It causes progressive brain damage that leads to certain death. So an animal with rabies is going to look like it has brain damage. Something is going to be wrong with it. It's going to be behaving in some weird way, and it could be any number of things. But usually, your reaction is that animal is just not acting right. It's acting like something's wrong with its brain. And if you see a raccoon or fox that has neurological symptoms, that's when you should start thinking that that animal might have rabies. Of course, if it's biting at the air or at inanimate objects, that's the way the rabies virus spreads to new hosts. So a lot of biting activity or moving the jaw around, that can be a cause of concern. And that's also a sign of seizures in wildlife. Also, everybody's usually aware of unprovoked aggression. Certainly that's something to be concerned with. And absolutely, if somebody or a pet has been bitten by any mammal, that animal or that person needs to go to the doctor, or that pet needs to go to a veterinarian and seek treatment. And then having any kind of direct physical contact. This is especially important for bats, because bats, they have their own variant of rabies, the bat variant, and bats have really, really tiny needle-like teeth. So if you pick up a bat that you think is sick on the ground and it bites you, you might not bleed. You might not even know you've been bitten. So direct physical contact with a mammal that, especially a rabies vector species, that's something that you're going to want to seek treatments for and see if you need to get the rabies vaccine or get the animal tested to see if it had rabies. Okay, so notice what you don't see on this list is a nocturnal animal out during the day. And that's because that's not actually a sign of rabies. So let's kind of talk about what you don't need to be concerned about. You'll notice, by the way, all of my pictures of foxes and raccoons are all during the daytime, and these are perfectly healthy animals. A fox hanging out in the neighborhood. Foxes live in neighborhoods. That's not a reason to be concerned. A fox passing through the yard. Your yard is probably part of its territory. That's not inherently a reason to be worried. Foxes are ubiquitous. They're everywhere and they live in neighborhoods. A fox out during the daytime. Again, even though technically these animals are nocturnal, it's a rule of thumb, not a hard, fast, absolute rule. And foxes and raccoons have lots of reasons to be awake during the daytime that have nothing to do with disease. A fox hanging around a food source. It's probably hanging around the food source because it's perfectly healthy and taking advantage of that food source. So an animal that's eating and, otherwise engaging in healthy, normal behavior probably is not going to have rabies. If it runs away when you approach it, that is a very healthy sign. Fox hanging around for weeks or months. Something to know about rabies is that once symptoms start, death happens in a matter of days. So if somebody says that they've seen a fox hanging around for several weeks, the chance that it has rabies is very slim because it's probably hanging around for another reason. And if it had rabies, it probably would not still be alive. Okay, let's talk about raccoons and squirrels. I kind of put those in the same bin because the types of problems that people report about them tend to be very similar. These are highly opportunistic animals. They're very agile, and they love taking advantage of food sources like bird feeders. So The best way to deal with conflicts or prevent conflicts with these animals is to remove food sources. And yes, that means removing pet food or bird feeders, and removing access to buildings, because a lot of the property damage involving these two animals is them getting access to roofs of buildings and actually getting into attics. So you want to, there you go, remove food sources, definitely. And this is the type of damage that we see from raccoons or squirrels. They can use their little hands or teeth to pry and get into attic spaces. And the way you would want to deal with this is make sure that your home is in good repair. And if you see any kind of damage like this, you definitely want to make repairs and use things like hardware cloth. That's a hardware cloth on the right, which is excellent for keeping animals out of places they shouldn't be. And then chicken wire also, because these animals can't chew through the wire or remove it. We'll talk about deer really quickly. Again, this is the species that people call about more than any other species in North Carolina. And I'll talk about the types of problems that people have. Usually these problems revolve around damage to landscaping. Deer are large herbivores and they can eat a lot of plant material, and pretty much a hungry deer is going to eat anything it can get a hold of. So one of the best ways of dealing with deer problems is to physically keep them out of areas where you have expensive landscaping or a vegetable garden or someplace where you cannot tolerate any deer browsing damage. Repellents can be effective. And then finally, the other main solution is going to be hunting, especially in more rural areas. So let me show some examples of this. A deer fence, if you want to keep deer out of your entire yard, a good deer fence has to be at least 8 feet tall. So your typical 6-foot fence is good at keeping coyotes out and dogs in, but is not going to keep deer out. So here I have an illustration or a photo of a really great deer fence that is not only effective, but also attractive. A deer fence doesn't have to be this impenetrable wall that, you can't see through. It can be attractive. It just has to make sure that the deer can't jump over it or through it. And this is a really nice example of a good deer fence that is also very attractive. So you would use this to keep deer out of a big area, but you can use smaller versions of fencing to maybe keep them out of a particular vegetable garden. So here, the fence is enclosing what is probably like a 15-foot by 15-foot area. And so the fence doesn't have to be 8 feet tall in that situation, because the deer aren't going to jump into that tiny area, because it would feel to the deer like it was jumping into a cage. So it doesn't have to be as tall if you're fencing in a small area. And then for individual plants, if you have a particular plant that maybe you just put in the ground and you really don't want any deer damage on it, you can have an individual fence just around that plant. So excluding deer, physically keeping them away from the plants that you're trying to protect, is the best way to preserve your landscaping from deer damage. Real quick, I want to talk about deer repellents. Essentially, they don't like really strong flavors. So deer repellents that are either spicy, like hot peppers, or mint flavored things tend to be effective. They need to be sprayed on the plant in a way that the deer will taste it if they try to eat it, because something that smells is not going to keep deer away. They have to literally get the repellent in their mouth and then think that it tastes so bad that they're not interested. Other types of repellents that work for deer have either bone meal or blood meal, or especially it's labeled as putrescent egg solids. So it smells like rotten eggs or tastes like rotten eggs, and that can be very effective. Again, it has to be applied directly to the plant so that the deer have to actually get it into their mouth, because if it just has a smell, it's not going to be effective. And the good news is anything that's really good at keeping deer away, like an exclusion fence or repellents, is also going to work against rabbit damage. I'm kind of coming up on time, and so I'm going to speed through some of this a little bit to make sure I can get to the important resources at the end of my talk. So I'm going to skip over hunting, and also want to say this is definitely one of the issues with deer that we see really, really often. People come across fawns in the spring and early summer that are newborn and instinctually basically just stay put while mom, the doe, sort of wanders away. And hands down, the best thing that you could possibly do if you see a fawn all by itself that's laying there quietly is to leave it alone. This is normal, healthy behavior. And that deer fawn it needs to be where mom left it, because when the doe comes back, she's going to want to have her fawn there where she left it. So saving fawns because they're perceived to be abandoned is unfortunately really common because people don't understand that this is normal, natural behavior. So please leave deer fawns alone if you find them. Take a few pictures, enjoy the experience, but do not try to save them. Same thing with these little guys. This is a mockingbird fledgling. This is a young bird that has left the nest intentionally, and it doesn't know how to fly yet, but it's learning. And just like a toddler learning how to walk, they kind of suck at it at first, but they have to have that practice before they can develop the muscles to fly successfully. So a young bird that's hopping around, even if it can't fly, needs to be left alone because it is in the process of learning how to fly and its parents are still taking care of it. We want to avoid wild animal kidnapping, basically, when people see these young animals and they assume that they need help, when in reality, trying to intervene can actually be a death sentence for those animals. Okay, and then real quick, pop quiz. If a snake has a triangular head, is it venomous? Is that true or false? No. So we have a lot of snake species in North Carolina, almost 40 different species, and many of them will flatten their jaw to make their face appear triangular when they feel threatened. Many non-venomous species. If there's one venomous species that you know how to identify successfully, it should be the copperhead, because that is the most common venomous species that we have in North Carolina. They are everywhere, including all over Wake County. If anybody can guess which one of these snakes is a copperhead, I will give you a second and then say, fooled you, because actually none of them are. This is a copperhead on the left side. They have this upright line of Hershey Kisses pattern on the side of their body. And if you see that Hershey Kiss pattern, that's going to mean copperhead, and definitely stay away, stay clear of those animals. The actual snakes on the right there's a brown snake on the top. The middle one is a juvenile rat snake, and the bottom one is a northern water snake, all non-venomous and completely harmless to humans. Okay, let me go. There we go. My final resources very quickly. Where to get help. So if you have a wildlife encounter, there's two main resources of people who can help you with dealing with that situation. First off, if you have some situation where wildlife animals are causing property damage, they're getting into buildings, they're damaging property in some form or fashion, wildlife control agents are like basically pest control services, but they specialize in wildlife and they have special licenses that help, that allow them to deal with wildlife conflicts. So wildlife control agents are going to be the best resource for wildlife complaints or wildlife damage specifically. And then in situations where you find an animal that you perceive needs help, it's either injured or sick or orphaned, that is going to be wildlife rehabilitators who are licensed and trained to be able to provide help for wild animals and get them back out into the wild so that they can survive on their own. I have a couple resources that have QR codes. So this will be recorded and you can use these QR codes later if you want to revisit these resources. But we have a map of all of the licensed wildlife rehabilitators in North Carolina that you can access online and find out where they are and what species they work with. And then the same for wildlife control agents. You can go onto the website of the Wildlife Resources Commission and find wildlife control agents in your area that can help you with all manner of wildlife damage issues. And then finally, if you want to speak to a wildlife biologist and ask questions about what you should do in a particular situation, or just want to know more about the wildlife in your area, please don't hesitate to call the wildlife helpline. Our biologists are extremely knowledgeable. They can provide advice on what your legal options are, what the best options are, just in terms of your particular situation and your personal resources. They're not a dispatch service. They're not like 911 where they can send somebody out, but they can provide customized advice for you on what you can do in the situation, and they can get you in contact with or provide contact information for professionals who can help you out, or tell you how to solve the problem on your own. So finally, to wrap up, how do I recommend that we can support wildlife responsibly? Um, Again, kind of you noticed food and access to food came up over and over again. We don't want to support wildlife by providing artificial or human provided foods because it leads to a lot of conflicts. But the best way to support wildlife is to provide natural habitat for them, provide the foods that these animals evolved to take advantage of. So, native wildflowers grow birdseed. The birdseed that plants have been, or the bird seeds that birds have been eating for eons come from native plants. So, if we grow native plants, those will provide the bird seed, and then we don't have to have a bird feeder that could attract bears and raccoons and squirrels and other animals that we might not want on our property. Or plant an oak tree, because you know what? Baby birds don't eat bird seed, they eat insects, and oak trees provide the best possible habitat for our native pollinators. So there you go. If you want to support wildlife, provide natural habitat for them when possible. Plant native plants in your yard. Don't put food out for wildlife because it can lead to conflicts. And that is kind of the quick and dirty intro to common wildlife encounters. And now, if anybody has any questions, if there's time, I would love to answer them.
All right. Thank you so much, Fallon. That was a really great presentation. As she said, we are now starting our Q&A session of the lecture. If you've got any questions, please feel free to either unmute yourself and just call the questions out, or you can put them in the chat and I will read them out for everybody. I had a question. Oh, sorry, Heather, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go for it.
I have a hunting question. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
So my school backs up to Wake County Park property, and they gave us access to it. So we take the kids for walks on it. Mm-hmm. It's a brand new school, and we came across a hunter on the property. What are the laws regarding bow and arrow hunting in the city of Raleigh?
If it's within Raleigh city limits, it is actually not legal to discharge a bow and arrow in Raleigh city limits. Okay. So yes, and that's not the case everywhere, because every municipality has its own rules about dangerous projectiles, and every county has its own rules. So right now we are in deer hunting season, but you have to have permission on the property where you hunt, and you have to be using equipment that's legal in that area. So bows and arrows are not legal to use in Raleigh.
Okay, thank you for confirming that.
And I say that as a hunter. Yeah, you gotta know the local rules where you hunt for sure.
Absolutely, absolutely. Not against them, but it was a little off-putting because he was so close to the school.
Awesome. Thanks, Heather. Any other questions? I had one. In your stats, you were showing that foxes are really high for rabies. Is that like, I guess this is kind of a multi-tiered question. Is that because is that measuring like number of foxes that have rabies or just number of foxes with rabies reports? And then why are there so many more foxes with rabies than coyotes?
Aha. Okay. So let me put the data in the context a little bit better. And that is, those are all of the animals that have tested positive for rabies since 1990, right? That's
Mhm.
certainly not all of the animals that have ever been tested of those species. And that is in no way a representation of the total population of those animals. So even for raccoons, which are our most common rabies vector species, most raccoons in North Carolina do not have rabies. It's a 100% lethal disease. If every raccoon had rabies, then they would all be dead. We would not have any raccoons in the state. So the actual proportion of animals that have rabies is much, 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 much lower. We're talking about maybe 1 or 2%. I know in bats, the incidence rate of rabies in bats, even though they're one of our top 4 rabies vector species, is like 0.5% of bats in North Carolina have rabies. So most foxes do not have rabies, but when you add up all the foxes that have tested positive for rabies, they're in that top 4. Um, and in terms of why so many more foxes test positive for rabies than coyotes, um, for better or for worse, I don't know if there's good. I don't. Let me just say this. I don't think there's very hard and fast evidence, but I will take a really good educated guess, and that is that some species, just by virtue of their behavior or their size, are less likely to come in contact with rabies or to be exposed, like get bitten by an animal that might have rabies. So. Um,
So
Yeah, we've
possibly
got
because the coyote's bigger?
possibly because coyotes are bigger and they're not, the density isn't as high. We've got a lot more foxes in North
Yeah,
Carolina than
that was my other
coyotes.
question.
Um, and I would say just part of their natural history and how they interact with other animals means that they're less likely to come in contact with another rabid animal or get bitten by a rabid animal. That's a really great question, and I'm just happy to say that the data show that we don't really have to lose sleep over the idea of rabid coyotes. I don't know exactly why that is, but I'm very happy to be able to report that.
Yeah, yeah, especially with how big they are. I was actually surprised to see opossums on the list at all because I thought they couldn't get rabies.
It's very, very rare for them to get it, but it is possible. Technically, it's possible for any mammal to get rabies, but as you can see in the data, some animals are way more susceptible than others.
Okay, thank you. We have another question here from Yoon and Patrick. If actually from their 9-year-old son, if a person gets rabies, how long do they have to live?
Oh, it can be really variable, but the thing about rabies is that if an animal or a person actually gets the rabies disease, they will die from it, which is why it's so important that if you know you have or you think you might have been bitten or come in contact with a rabid animal, it's really, really crucially important to go to your doctor because there's a vaccine that you can get that will prevent you from getting rabies. It's extremely effective. And if you don't get that vaccine, but you've been exposed to rabies and you actually get the rabies disease, it is 100% fatal or very, very nearly 100% fatal. So don't play around with rabies. Always see a doctor if you think you might have come in contact with it.
And how long do they have to live if they do get it? Is it just like 2 days or 3 days?
It could be, there's a really wide range because there's an incubation period, and the incubation period could be months or it could be weeks, depending on where the bite was. Like if the bite was on the tip of the finger, it actually takes time for the virus to get all the way to the brain. But if somebody were to get, bitten on their face, then it would take a very short period of time for the virus to get to the brain. So it's really, really variable, that incubation period. But once the symptoms start to set in, um, yeah, that happens very quickly.
Great question. 9-year-old son.
I'm happy to answer those questions, but they're really hard to answer because it's a scary disease.
Sure. All right. Well, we only have 3 minutes left in our meeting. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. If you have any other questions, please feel free to email me, same email that you got the link from this morning, and I'll be happy to pass those on to Fallon. Thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you, Fallon, for presenting. If you are seeking environmental education credit, I am sending a follow-up email later this week. If the weather and daycare cooperates, you should have that by Friday. If not by then early next week. In that email, there will also be a recording of this lecture, and I will send that link out as well. I hope to see everyone again during our next lecture. Let me pull that up for you. That is going to be January 12th. That's with Rebecca Wofford of Wake County Parks, Recreation, and Open Space. She'll be presenting on birding by ear. Registration for that is now open on the RecLink website for City of Raleigh Parks. And I hope you guys all have a fabulous evening. Good night, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.